My name is George Falconer and welcome to I'd Rather Have a Fish Supper. You may wonder why I'm calling it that, but you'll have to wait till a future video. But this is called I'd Rather Have a Fish Supper, and this is my life story. I was born in Dunfermline in 1956. The staff thought that I was dead before I was born, I think. Anyway, that's what they told my mother. You can imagine how she must have reacted, thinking, oh, my baby's dead. However, the staff got it wrong, and I was born. And I'm told that we lived in an attic at the top of my grandparents' house. Now, they had used the house as a boarding house for people who were appearing at the local opera house, which is really like a music hall theatre where the variety acts of the day appeared. And my grandfather was a coal miner, so he would go off to his work, and my grandmother, I believe, ran the house, and I believe she was an excellent cook. And my cousin, who became a chef, learned cooking from her. Anyway, they ran the house for the purpose of putting up people from the opera house, and my grandmother had a rule: first come, first served, except Lex McLean. He gets to stay every time. And my mum told me that Lex McLean used to sit in the kitchen and tell them jokes, to which my reaction was, Mum, don't you know how people used to pay to hear Lex McLean tell them jokes, and you're telling me that he sat in your kitchen and told you jokes for nothing? What was that like? And apparently the dancers would come to the theatre, to the opera house, throw off their bags, and then run round to the house as quickly as they could to try to get a bed. And there would arguments saying, it's my turn to stay with Mrs. Wilson this time. You stayed here the last time. So I think my grandmother had to sort out quite a few arguments amongst the dancers. Big stars of the day appeared at the opera house, and evidently some of them were hosted by my grandmother. I remember sitting watching the television, and a woman who was obviously a jazz pianist called Winifred Atwell came on television, and my mum said, oh, Winifred Atwell, she's still alive. This Winifred Atwell had been a big star in her day, and she had stayed at the house, as did Jimmy Logan's parents. So you see, it was a place where you could be a big star and still find yourself being hosted in the same house as the dancers. Evidently, it must have made an income for them, and so they have my grandfather's income from the house, and my granddad was a knocker-upper. That meant he went round the streets knocking on the doors of other coal miners to make sure they were up and ready to go to the pit. And we assume that he got paid extra for doing this. As I grew up, we moved to Glatley Road, and every day my mum would take me to the flat that my granddad and Auntie Margaret moved into. They'd given up the house by then, and they'd moved to this flat, and I don't remember my grandmother, but she must have moved there too, and she died. So that left my granddad and my mother's twin sister, Auntie Margaret, in this flat, and we used to go there every day. and Mum would leave me there while she went off shopping. And what seemed very strange to a small boy like me was this elderly man with a white collar sometimes would come, and he would sit with my aunt at the table, and they would sit there with their eyes shut like this and talk like this, blah 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 blah. And they had wine and they had bread. I had no idea what was going on. I just knew this man brought little glasses of wine and little bits of bread, and he sat at the table going blah 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 blah. And of course his mode of dress was that of a minister. I worked out later that he was a retired minister of their church, and he was bringing her communion, and he was Peter Peace. So communion was brought to the flat, and also when we moved to Glackley Road, we had a family on one side of us, 3 girls, and I became quite good friends with 2 of the girls, and I used to play shops with them. And then on the other side of the fence, was Doris. Now that's something of note, because some years later I was going to meet Doris again, and Doris figured quite prominently in my life from my late teens onwards. And I found when I went to school, I started at Black Law School, and it was quite disturbing for me because the teacher was hardly ever there. It wasn't the school itself that disturbed me, it was the fact that the teacher was hardly ever there, and we got different people all the time trying to teach us, which I found very disturbing indeed. The teacher was probably off ill and couldn't help it, and the head of the infants department, Miss Melville, did her very best to get people to teach us, and even teach us herself. And I can remember one occasion, I was a very sensitive child, and she basically said to us, if you get something wrong, I think this was arithmetic, if you get something wrong, then you'll get a belting. She said this to try to encourage us to do our very best. Unfortunately though, I was so disturbed that it alarmed me. And guess who got something wrong, eh? It was me. And so she did a little cuff over the back of my head when she saw the thing I'd done wrong. Silly thing. Well, I couldn't control myself. I cried and cried and cried. I couldn't stop. And eventually Miss Melville looked at me and she just gently smiled and comforted me and put her arm around me and said, it's just a silly mistake you made. But she hadn't realised how sensitive I was and how disturbed I was, because we didn't have the same teacher every day. Well, eventually my family decided that we were all going to live together with my aunt and my granddad. By this time my brother was born, and I can remember getting into a taxi with my dad and Mum coming out of the maternity hospital, and Dad said to me, look at the baby, George. So I looked, and there he was, my brother. I remember seeing him for the very first time. So we moved to the top of the town, and then I started at another school. I started at my mum and her sister's former primary school, it was commercial school. So commercial proved to be much better for me. For one reason, although it was a much older school, it had Victorian buildings. Blacklaw had modern buildings. The teacher, Miss Hunter, did the one thing that I desperately needed. She turned up for work every single day and got on with it. I found that I settled in to commercial much better. I also made a few friends. I made absolutely no friends at Blacklaw. In fact, I was such an outcast at Blacklaw that on one occasion a box of rods got burst and I got blamed for it, and the teacher believed the story. It was me who did it. It wasn't. I still don't know who did it. And anyone who's out there now, if it was you, well... But anyway, that's my first experience of someone lying about me and everybody believing it. Commercial, much better for me. I made a particular friend, and I made a few other friends as well. And one of these friends also was friends with me at Sunday school. So I was a lot happier. And every year, one of the things I loved about the school was we went to the gala once a year. The gala was held down the Glen, the local park, also officially called Pittencrieff Park, which is really an estate, and it's enormous. And if you ever get the chance to go there, I highly recommend it. But anyway, we would march in our classes behind bands all the way down the high street to the Glen with our teacher, and there we would sit down, play games and have our lunch with the teacher before we finally broke up. And we had these things that we chanted as we went down the high street. Hip, hip, hooray, this is a gala day. If we don't get a holiday, we'll all run away. Because it was a lead up to the holidays. And it was just something that sounded good to chant. And you discovered at the gala that your teacher was a human being. Because that was the one day your teacher didn't do any teaching. She simply looked after you, played games with you, and had lunch with you. So teachers, we know you're humans. On one occasion, the school took my class to Dunfermline Abbey, which wasn't very far away from the school. And someone, a man, showed us around the abbey, and there were two things that I remember he pointed out. He pointed out the pillars in the nave, the older part of the abbey, which dates from Norman times. And there's two pillars that have got zigzag lines on them. And he made us stand at one of the pillars and look at it. And then he'd move us round to look at the same pillar from a different vantage point. And he would point out the difference. If you looked at it from one direction, it seemed to be narrow at the bottom and wide at the top. From a different direction, it seemed the opposite way round. And he told us that neither of these perspectives were the truth. It was in fact the same all the way up. it was the zigzag lines that caused the illusion. A number of kings are buried in Dunfermline Abbey, which he pointed out, but the most famous one of them all is buried under the pulpit in the Victorian part of the abbey, with a big plaque over it, and that's King Robert the Bruce. The man who showed us round told us that the body was discovered and identified, and before it was reburied, they measured it and found that Robert the Bruce was the tallest king that Scotland ever had, at 6'2". That'd be still quite tall even nowadays. So he's buried under the abbey pulpit, and when you look up at the tower you can see the words King Robert the Bruce. And so that's one of Dunfermline's claims to fame. Robert the Bruce is buried there, as are a number of other kings, and Queen Margaret is also buried in the grounds out there. So that was an interesting school visit. It must have been, because it's stuck in my mind for all these years. Also, the school participated in the annual flower show. We would grow flowers in a pot, and they would be displayed in the pavilion in the glen, and prizes would be awarded. I was disqualified one year. You may wonder, how can you get disqualified in a flower show? Well, it's easy. You just pick a fancy flower pot and stick your bulb into that, not just the ordinary red clay one. And because mine was in a very decorative vase, I was disqualified. Disqualified? Can you believe it? Disqualified in a flower show. Now, when I went to commercial school, I did have some difficulty because I had gone to Black Law for 6 months. And when I went to commercial, I found that I just couldn't use the rods. Well, the rods were a visual display for helping you to learn mathematics and arithmetic, and they'd used them in Black Law. And they were still using them in Black Law when I left. When I went to commercial, they must have been just slightly ahead and had stopped using the rods and could do it all in their head. Well, I couldn't do that. So it was decided by the head of the department I would be put back 6 months and start school all over again, which meant that I was not in the class that I was intended to be. I was in the class next door. On reflection, I'm glad that happened, because the class I was supposed to be in, they really suffered. I've no idea what was going on with their teacher, but when we went down to the big school, the school consisted of 2 buildings, the infants department building and the big school. We were next door in the big school to the class I should have been with, and every single day we heard their teacher bawling and shouting at them. And our own teacher acted like nothing was happening. Obviously she could hear this, but she pretended nothing was happening and certainly didn't make any remarks about it. And I think that the teacher next door was having a breakdown, bawling and shouting like that. And I'm glad she wasn't my teacher, because I was so sensitive that it would have broken me if I had her. The teachers I had at commercial were excellent. They did their jobs and did it well. as I say, this poor woman next door, I really think she was having a breakdown. I'm convinced of it. But that's by the by. Dad worked in a factory. Dunfermline was known for its linen, and Dad came from Rutherglen, and when he got married to Mum, he needed a job, and so he had to look around the town, or the city as it was. Let me come to that. Eventually he found a job in a factory and stayed there for the rest of his working life. Now, let me just say that when I was a boy, Dunfermline was called the City and Royal Borough of Dunfermline. Somehow that disappeared. And before her death, Her Majesty the Queen declared Dunfermline a city. But I say she declared Dunfermline a city again. So once again, I come from a city. Like I did when I was a boy anyway. Children are taught to be obedient to their parents. Well, I would walk to school and get the bus home. But one day, Mum said that she was going to be in the town, and when I came out of school, I had to wait for her. So, like a good little boy, I came out of school and waited for her. And waited. And waited. And waited and waited. There was no sign of her. And it got dark. And I was still waiting. Because she told me to wait. Eventually, my grandfather emerged from the shadows. And he took me home. I was simply obedient. Mum didn't realise that because she told me to wait, that's exactly what I would do. Evidently, Grandad worked it out and realised where I would be. Granddads, eh? They can be terribly useful. But again, that was probably because I was a sensitive child. Obedient. I'll not say I wasn't ever a naughty boy, but Mum just thought I must be missing. Somebody must have kidnapped me. Grandad worked it out. Now at school, there was a boy who frequently got into fights. He wasn't a bully, but somehow he just got into a lot of fights. And he would be sent to the deputy rector. Now, he was sent to a man who's called the head teacher. That was a title there, head teacher. But head teacher did not mean headmaster. It really meant deputy headmaster who was still in the classroom. And apart from the headmaster, this head teacher, a Mr. Matthews, was the only man on the staff. He was certainly the only man in the classroom. And so this boy, called Gray, got sent to him a lot for fighting. And I remember my very first day of going to school, knowing full well we were starting primary 7. And I thought, what's it going to be like for Gray now? We all know who teaches primary 7. He has been sent to Mr. Matthews so many times. What's it going to be like now that the teacher is Mr. Matthews? And I remember walking into the classroom, and Gray was walking in at the same time, and Mr. Matthews said to him, "You, Professor, I've got a special desk for you." And he put a desk down beside his own for Gray. To this very day, I can tell you how many times Gray got into trouble that year. No, not at all. It was good for him. Well, the time came when I was 12 and due to go to secondary school. But I didn't go up to secondary school with the people that I had been educated with. I went up to secondary school at the same time as my original class. I'd been put back 6 months, remained back 6 months, but when it came to the time of going to secondary school, I was sent at the appropriate time. So, off to secondary school I went, and that was a whole new adventure. Up until then, I had joined the Second Fife YMCA Cubs, which was good for me, and I stayed there until I was 16. And I learned skills in the Scouts, such as fire and cooking. I recommend the Scouts to anyone. You'll learn life skills in there. And as we were growing up too, we went to church. Now, it was quite a liberal church looking back. It had a drama group which did Scots comedies, and it also had a walking group which I wasn't part of. But eventually I grew up through Sunday school and the teens. But one of the things the minister was exceptional about was telling children stories. And I can still tell you a couple of those stories, and I've discovered that these same stories are online. Evidently ministers passed these stories around. And he told us when we were in the teens that he learned to tell stories by telling them to his own daughters, and his daughters would always make him use the same words every time. Children can educate you, you know. These stories, in the long run, were good for me in that they communicated gospel truths which stuck with me. They didn't mean anything to me. I quite enjoyed the stories, but it stuck with me. And God used that later. God doesn't always act promptly. Sometimes he takes you stage by stage, so there comes a point where you're ready to hear the full gospel truth. And these stories were a part of it. Anyway, this has been part 1 of I'd Rather Have a Fish Supper.